There are many intersections between economics and history, and one of the first times in our course when we'll come upon them is in the aftermath of the First World War. Uh, and there are some key economic terms that historians will feel comfortable using, but that might need a little bit of background from an economics perspective. And especially in thinking about post-war Europe, those words might be inflation and deflation. Now, generally, these two words really just have to do with prices going up and prices going down. And so this is an increase in the average price level, and this is a decrease in the average price level. Now, once we've started talking about that, it might be worth considering what we mean, in fact, by an increase in the average price level or a decrease in the average price level. And so to go down that, that'll take us down this rabbit hole, and we'll need to talk a little bit about that. But in general, when when the price of goods are increasing rapidly, um, we can call that a high level of inflation. When they're increasing gradually, we might call that normal inflation. And if the price of goods in general, the average price of all goods is falling, we might call that deflation. But to really understand these concepts in a historical way and for them to be useful for you moving forward, it might actually be beneficial for you to understand the mechanism behind these changes in prices. Hopefully, you're familiar with the concept that the price and the quantity of a good or a service is a function of supply and demand. So, in economics classes, we can feel very comfortable saying that we can think about the price of a good and the quantity of that good. And we can say that as the price of the good increases, producers are going to be willing and able to supply more of that good. And conversely, as prices of a good fall, consumers are going to be willing and able to buy more of the good. You'll buy more airplane tickets if airplane tickets go on sale. Maybe you'll take 3 flights per year instead of 1 flight per year. So the demand for a good or a service has a downward slope. And then, because it's a function of both supply and demand, we can find wherever they intersect will give us the price and the quantity of, in our example, airplane tickets being sold. Now, that's just a very general introduction to how price and quantity can work together. However, with inflation and deflation, we are not talking about what the price of airplane tickets or of houses or of cars or of pickles or of apples, or we're talking about the whole economy. So we're going to need to adjust our thinking a little bit, and we're going to need to adjust our axes a little bit. If price is what we had on our first axis, here we're going to talk about the average price. So this is not of one good, but the average price if we're able to combine all of the prices for all of the goods and services in a whole country. And instead of talking about the quantity, now we're going to be talking about the total production for the whole country. And once again, it makes sense that suppliers are going to be willing and able to supply their services, and that they'll produce more as the average price increases. And consumers, we can say that consumers are going to demand more of that total production if the price level for all goods in general is lower. Now, technically, we really should adjust a couple of things. I mean, if people stop demanding goods or if the price level falls, there's a certain level at which the price level, people simply aren't going to be willing to produce anything. So we probably should round off our supply curve here in a slightly different way. And then, no matter how much we want of something, we probably have a limit in terms of how much we can actually produce. So it's probably more accurate to talk about maybe something like a supply curve that might look a little bit more like this, just to be totally accurate. Because what that's going to let us do is that's going to let us consider that there is a limit to our total production. And so our supply curve eventually kind of becomes vertical here. And there's also a floor where producers really aren't going to keep producing in this region here. That's sort of more of an imaginary area. So if we think of this as looking a little bit like how the general economy works, and the word that we use in economics for combining things together is to aggregate them. So we would call this aggregate supply and aggregate demand. And right now you have a diagram it's a bit rough, but it would be familiar to most economists in terms of how things are working. And it certainly is going to be sufficient for us in terms of understanding our concepts of inflation and deflation. So when we think about inflation, which is going to be an increase in the average price level, what we mean is that we're going to have that price level going up here along our y-axis. Well, what needs to happen in order for average prices to go up? There's only two things that can cause inflation. It can be caused when demand, aggregate demand in this case, shifts out or increases, or if aggregate supply shifts in or decreases. Those are our only things that will cause inflation. So we could imagine maybe we have our aggregate supply here, shifts back. Oh, look, that's increased our average price level up to a higher level. Or we could imagine, well, what if there's a lot more demand for a good or a service? Well, that's also going to cause, for all goods and all services, that's also going to cause an increase in the average price level. So when we think about post-war Europe, we can actually think here, if post-war Europe experienced inflation, this was because, on the one hand, there was a greater demand for goods and services. Workers had earned wages during the war and they were eager to cash those in. But also, the war had converted a lot of factories to war production. And in many of the major powers, a large portion of their workforce had been destroyed. So they were able to produce less than they were before. So in post-war Europe, we have sort of a double shift here, and we end up with an increase in those average price levels, which we call inflation, both because there could be greater demand for goods and services, and the supply of those goods and services was reduced. So that inflation was caused by both of those inflation triggers occurring at the same time. Now, we usually think of people who demand things as being consumers. But of course, also companies can demand goods and services, and the government can demand goods and services. And in Europe, in 1918, for example, governments are demanding, in general, this is a rough figure, but I think it's easy to remember that by 1918, governments are demanding about half of the total production that's happening in their countries is being consumed by the government and put into the war effort. So all of a sudden, when this demand and the things that are being demanded drop off, there is a potential for aggregate demand to shift way back and for there to be deflation, a fall in the average price levels. What are the things that make consumers willing and able to spend money? Well, one of it is having money. And so, one thing that we see governments doing after the war, both in countries that won the war and in countries that lost the war, is being quite generous with how the government is spending money and how the government is giving away money. So, you can imagine the government might be paying pensions to soldiers who are no longer able to work. They're no longer able to help the supply of their country, but they are able to demand its production. So that could lead to inflation. In general, if the government continues to pump money into the economy, that's going to continue to shift out aggregate demand. And at a certain point, that shift out in aggregate demand is going to end up hitting the full productive capacity of the economy. And at that point, production can't increase. Production is limited to this line here. But prices can increase very dramatically, very quickly. And that can be called hyperinflation. Now, how do these things relate to currency and the depreciation of a currency? Well, the two ways that I would point out here is that in general, inflation, if it's really true that the price of everything went up at the same level, that might not be such a problem. Milk goes up and doubles in price. Rent goes up and doubles in price. But your wages go up because the price of labor doubles. So fine. Yesterday, I was being paid $10 an hour for the work that I was doing, and the milk cost $1 a liter. Today, I'm getting paid $20 an hour and the milk costs $2 a liter. It still is that I need to work for 1/10 of an hour for 6 minutes to earn my liter of milk. So, in that sense, it doesn't seem why inflation might be such a problem. In general, though, inflation strikes certain parts of the economy much faster than it strikes other parts of the economy. And not everybody is working for a flexible wage. And many people, especially retired people, may be on a fixed income and may be dependent on savings. So for them, it does make a big deal that the milk is now twice as expensive. Another way that this can be a problem is because some of the goods and services that you use are going to come from abroad. And as the government spends more money and creates more currency, just like we saw here in our supply and demand diagram, this could also work for the supply of a currency. And so if the government creates a lot more of a currency, you can see that the price or the value of that currency is going to go down. So if the German government decides to pump a lot more Reichsmarks into the economy, the value of those Reichsmarks is going to go down. Now, we're not going to feel that inside Germany initially, but if we try to buy goods, if we try to buy clothing from abroad, if we try to buy rubber from abroad, if we try to buy tea from abroad, or coffee from abroad, or steel from abroad, or coal from abroad, all of a sudden the depreciation or the devaluing of our currency is going to have a real destabilizing effect. It's going to mean that there are certain imported goods that we cannot buy, and the price of those imported goods is going to go up a lot, and this is also going to contribute to hyperinflation. Now, I've tried to condense some really complicated economic ideas down into a simple way in the context of this economic lens. And One danger of explaining something in a new context is you can overcomplicate it, you can share too much or too little. I hope you found that I've struck a fair balance here in terms of trying to explain these concepts in a detailed way, but in a way that doesn't get too technical. But these diagrams that I have for you here, they really are the core of how economists model both the economy for individual goods and services and for the whole economy. And so a simple understanding of those will go a long way to helping you understand the economics of post-war Europe.